Hello and welcome to episode 302 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perriton, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast-attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other assignments. How are you this hot morning, Bill?
I'm doing great. It's a frigid 87 degrees in Florida. I think it's a little warmer where you are, Seth.
Indeed. Yeah, we down here in South Mississippi, South Louisiana are just cooking down here. Tomorrow's high forecast in Hattiesburg is 106. And that's not even the heat index. That's the real friggin' temperature. And we are over it, shall we say. I'm just ready for fall. Ready for fall. Well, before we get started, as we have been in most recent episodes, and we'll probably continue to go forward, please, we want to ask you to please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the videos as they come up. We do appreciate it. It helps YouTube push our media out to the masses, and we do appreciate that very much. For this episode specifically, we're going, even though we're in 1944 right now, we're going to take a step back into 1943 to cover an event that starts in 43, but the vast majority of it actually occurs in 1944. And with that, we'll get started right now. By late 1943, the situation in the South Pacific, specifically the New Guinea area, had decidedly turned in favor of the Allies. The Allies had driven the Japanese from their positions on most of New Guinea, with the Australians capturing Lae in September before driving on Finchhaven. Aussies pushed inland from Lae through Markham Valley, pushing the Japanese ever further away from Allied interest and digging their grave deeper and deeper and deeper with every operation. As the Allies made considerable headway in New Guinea, attention shifted towards securing the sea routes through the Vitiaz Strait in order to support operations on New Guinea's western side and further movement north. It was also felt that securing two Japanese airfields that sat near Cape Gloucester on New Britain would help to secure those sea lanes, while also continuing to add relentless pressure and harassment on the complex of Rabaul once those airfields were in Allied hands. To that end, General Douglas MacArthur cut orders in September 1943 for an operation set to be executed on December 26, 1943, the day after Christmas, that would send one division of the United States Marines to make an amphibious landing on the shores of Cape Gloucester, push inland, and secure the airfields. Finally recovering from their harrowing, certainly heroic ordeal on Guadalcanal, the newly outfitted and veteran 1st Marine Division left beloved Australia in August 1943 and began staging for the upcoming operation named BACKHANDER from New Guinea that autumn. The operation on Cape Gloucester, while short in terms of the old breed's former and future operations, would be considered one of their most difficult and miserable fights of the entire war. Bill, Cape Gloucester is Gloucester, however you want to pronounce it. I'm sure many linguists on the show will correct my pronunciation innumerable times. Cape Gloucester is one of those operations that it kind of, when you look at it in the grand scheme of things in the Pacific War, especially at this stage, it kind of gets lost in the mix, especially when you talk about 1st Marine Division, because of course you focus on Guadalcanal, and then you got the big nasty one at Peleliu, and then of course the ultimate at Okinawa. But Cape Gloucester is kind of right there in the middle. It's kind of an unknown operation to a lot of people, but it's a very important one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So I'm going to go to the map here, Seth, again. And as you said, the Aussies are managing the battle down here in the area of Papua New Guinea and Lae. And as you're going to be corrected on pronunciation of Cape Gloucester, as a longtime Hawaii resident, I'm inclined to say Laie, which is a town in Hawaii, but it is in fact Lae down here. The strait that you talked about is right over here, Seth. So, and then Cape Gloucester, that area of the the New Britain Island. Remember Rabaul right up here, and so this is a critical area. The question that we're going to be talking about today is whether it's worth the expense of taking these Japanese airfields, and that's going to be because this is going to be a slugfest. Okay, spoiler alert. These are jungles, rain, forests and things like that, full of swamps, and very impenetrable jungle that the Marines, and mostly the Marines, are going to have to slug through to get one, maybe two Japanese airfields. And there are many on the American side, even before the battle began, that thought this is probably not worth it. But General MacArthur, you know, critics will claim that he wanted to do something in his AOR to keep troops occupied and to keep advancing the offensive, because the offensive otherwise would get shifted to Nimitz's AOR, and rather than kind of be passive, he wanted to do something. And this certainly, Seth, is something.
It is. And, you know, in Mac's defense, he figured that by capturing these two airfields on the into Cape Gloucester there, like you were just showing, or the edge of Cape Gloucester there, as you were showing, it's going to help to continue to push this, put this pressure on Rabaul. And those who are watching and or listening are going to sit there and say, well, wait a minute. A couple episodes ago, you know, we took Bougainville to do that very same thing. Halsey sent his carrier forces in there to do that very same thing. And that's 100% accurate. That's 100% right. And MacArthur's looking at it and he's saying, we need to get a little bit closer. We've almost got this cockroach killed. You know, we're going to continue to pour on the insecticide and get rid of this damn thing once and for all. And by putting forces on Cape Gloucester, by taking these two airfields and establishing them in Allied hands, it will theoretically help to continue to put that constant pressure on Rabaul. And again, keep in mind that the whole purpose of putting pressure on Rabaul and neutralizing Rabaul is so that Mac can free forces to move up the other side of New Guinea and eventually, obviously, get back towards back to the Philippines. So another thing too about the possession of Cape Gloucester is if the Allies take it, if the Americans take it, and 1st Marine Division specifically, it would effectively sever Japanese supply routes from New Guinea to Rabaul and vice versa. So if we occupy these two airfields and establish a force there, there's absolutely no way that the Japanese are going to be able to get any kind of supplies out of Rabaul into New Guinea for the continuing fight without it coming under some sort of Allied aerial onslaught from this sector. So, I mean, if you look at the map, I mean, it does make perfect sense. But, of course, the question always is it worth it in the end? And we'll get to that. Now, the Gloucester operation was codenamed Backhander, was actually part of Operation Cartwheel, which is what we've been talking about, you know, almost the entire back end of season 2 when we're going through the Solomons. And, of course, again, as I said, it is the reduction and neutralization of Rabaul. And, Bill, almost as soon as Mac proposed this idea, it received flack from the people who were going to do the landing, didn't it? Wasn't it?
Yeah, it did. Not just them, but even General Kenny said, you know, the air commander said, you know, General, we have sufficient ability to strike Rabaul where we are with New Britain, or I'm sorry, with, you know, the bases that we landed in and around Bougainville Island and places like that. So again, going back to the map, you know, we've got this area covered. And remember, the strategy was rings around Rabaul. So, you know, assuming that we can sink pretty much anything that's coming in to strike Rabaul already, what's the point of yet another air base? So, you know, the point is that the 5th Air Force, whether they need it or not, was arguable. General Kenny felt it would take too long to build up the two airfields and get them operating on New Britain. So the Allies would outpace the buildup with the rapidity of the advance at that current time. So he didn't want the distraction of trying to build up these bases on New Britain at the same time he'd already had bases on Bougainville, Seth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you look at, again, you go back to that map, you can see that the Allied pace is going to rapidly outpace the area around Cape Gloucester. And, you know, you're 100% right. Kenny, frankly, at the end of the day is right. And that you know, there's enough rings around Rabaul, as you say, to pretty much render it impotent as it is. And at this stage in the war, December 1943, you know, almost January 1944, it's pretty much a dead duck. But Kenny wasn't the only one that was voicing his opposition, shall we say, to the plan. Other opponents were the assault troops themselves, that being the 1st Marine Division. The command echelon of the 1st Marine Division were none too happy about this operation. Not that they didn't want to get back into the war. They did. It wasn't, they'd been cooling their heels in Australia for long enough. One thought on the minds of every Guadalcanal veteran in the division, of which there was about 80-90% Guadalcanal veterans at this time, was the idea of another protracted jungle campaign that would get bogged down in the Cape Gloucester rainforest against the Japanese, a la Guadalcanal. This is not a coral atoll. This is not a flat location. You talked about it, when we started this. This is a tropical rainforest. This is a jungle. This is a place that is wetter more often than it is dry. It's complete opposite of Louisiana right now. But it's just miserable humidity and rain and rain and rain and rain and rain. And these guys who just got off of Guadalcanal a few months ago are fully aware of what a nasty set of conditions that can become, and they didn't want to get bogged down on that. So, Bill, as the summer wears into the fall and the operation neared 1st Division and 6th Army, of which this time 1st Marine Division is under the command of the 6th Army, could not gel on the plans for Gloucester, could they? They couldn't see eye to eye.
Yeah, it's incredible to me, Seth, that this even happened. Back in 1990, I hate to jump forward that far, I was a fresh graduate of what was then called Armed Forces Staff College, where we learn how to do campaign planning, right as Desert Shield was beginning to kick off. And so I was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Staff, and I was pulled into the crisis action team for the planning of the assault on retake of Kuwait and, throwing Iraq out of Kuwait. This is my only experience with campaign planning, real-time operational campaign planning, which is the only reason I bring it up. And when that campaign plan was being built, it was built largely by General Schwarzkopf, but all of the division commanders were party to the development of that campaign, and all of the division fire and movement that occurred, including the Marines during Desert Storm. They were party to the development of that operational plan. And so here you have a situation where somehow General MacArthur's staff develops a plan for, the Cape Gloucester that involves the 1st Marine Division, and the 1st Marine Division commander is not part of the development of that plan. You've got to be kidding me. They're the one central operational maneuver element in the entire plan. And they didn't like it? Like, what the heck? Did you cut them out of the voice, cut their voice out when it was, come to term, when it was time to develop the plan? How does this happen? I mean, now I can probably think of occasions where it happened in Nimitz's AOR, but not really. I mean, I'm struggling to think of it. I can think of times when the operational forces, the landing forces, didn't like the assignment they were given. Sure. I can't think of a time when Nimitz said, "This is how you're going to do it." He let them develop those plans. Now, somebody's going to point out, wait a minute, what about the bombardment duration at Tarawa? Well, it was the operational Navy commander who decided that, right? And with Nimitz's backing. It wasn't like they dictated to the Marines how they were going to do the landing for Tarawa. So again, how did they got in this situation? I have no idea.
It was a bit of a mess at the beginning anyway. And Mac's plan, to be clear, original plans for Gloucester said that the 6th Army, again, 1st Marine Division falling under 6th Army here, would order one regiment from the 1st Division to land, only one of 3, to land, and then be supported by the Army's 503rd Parachute Infantry, who would jump and land inland. Yeah, paratroopers. The Army ordered that say again?
No, it's just, we're going to have paratroopers jump into a rainforest. Now there's clearings, but again, these are not precision, parachutes of today. These are, you jump out of the plane and you hope the wind takes you where it wants to take you, right? Where you want to go. And so this is just, okay, I don't want to pile on here, but this is crazy. Even this Navy guy sees that this is crazy. But go ahead, Seth.
It's kind of convoluted, frankly. The Army ordered that the Marines would land and then drive through the jungle and rainforest and meet the soldiers on the plains beyond the jungle by D-Day. Okay, so that's not necessarily hard to obtain. Of course, now that being said, the people who had made these plans had absolutely no idea, about jungle fighting at this point. Yes, they'd been on New Guinea and things like that, but I'm talking about Walter Kruger was part of this. He was relatively new to the arena at this time. And even though he would be an outstanding commander that you're going to hear about a lot in 1944, this was, not really one of his best moments. Now, that being said, the savvy jungle vets that the 1st Marine Division were, and they were, staunchly said, that's not going to happen. What you want us to do with one friggin' regiment on D-Day is to penetrate a jungle that God knows how thick it actually is and meet paratroopers on the inland plains, which, if the jungle's not too thick, yeah, sure, we can probably do that if we don't run into heavy defenses, so on and so on and so on. So uninitiated in jungle combat, to the extent that the Marines were, the Army was astonished at 1st Marine Division Commanding Officer General Rupertus's reaction. Rupertus said, that this is not going to work. Nevertheless, the plans were what they were, and the 1st Division had to move. They were ordered to move to Goodenough Island in New Guinea to stage for the operation. And this is where MacArthur actually comes in and actually does some pretty remarkable things here. Several days later, after the 1st Marine Division gets to Goodenough Island, which is a strange name for an island, but I guess it's good enough. But several days, I'm not a comedian, I'm just going to say, several days later, no, MacArthur appeared to inspect the troops, and this gets interesting. He appears to inspect the troops, he's of course being a Marines, and discuss the operation with Rupertus and Colonel Pollock of the 1st Marine Division. Standing beside Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, Pollock, and Rupertus, MacArthur asked what the commanders thought of the plan. Colonel Pollock was the first to open his mouth and simply said, and I quote, "We don't like it, not one bit," unquote. MacArthur was aghast at this because he had not been, again, I'm loath to say, to defend MacArthur, he had not been informed of the plan, having been, basically crapped on by the Marines. He just assumed everything was kosher. He says, quote, "What is it you don't like, Colonel?" And Pollock answered, and this is all verbatim, "Sir, we don't like a damned thing about it," unquote. Surprisingly cordial, MacArthur kept his mouth shut and strode out of the tent. Apparently, discussions with Rupertus over the operation led to MacArthur issuing orders that changed things entirely. So these are his assault troops that are saying, this sucks, and we can't, this doesn't work. Yeah.
And credit MacArthur. I mean, we give him credit when credit is due. He changed the plan. He allowed the plan to be changed. He did what should have been done to begin with, which is he gave the assault troops a voice on what the plan should be. Okay, so you don't like that. What do you think will work? And they called for a new division. I'll bring up the map here. They called for a new plan completely. And so you have Cape Gloucester. Again, it's obviously right here. I'm going to try to get the marker up there. And so they're going to be two basically spearhead drives. The first one is going to be into Yellow Beach down here. And the next one is kind of a feint, is going to be on the west side, Green Beach, there. And so we'll go into a whole lot more detail on these as we go along. But at least they had a voice, Seth.
They did. And the important part here is that, again, MacArthur changed the plan, or he had his people change the plan. But instead of landing only one Marine regiment and, having to link up with paratroopers and all this other stuff, which God bless the paratroopers, but it's just not going to work in this territory, frankly. the 1st Marine Division was allowed to land their entire division, like everything. The whole kit and caboodle is allowed to land on day after Christmas, December 26, 1943. Deletion of the airborne landing and D-Day push through the jungle also eased the Marines' minds. In other words, Max said, okay, fine, you can have your way. The paratroopers don't need to be there. You can land everybody you need to and just do your best, essentially, to get the hell off the beach and get inland by D-Day. Again, taking into mind the aerial reconnaissance that had been done in the area and coast watchers and Alamo scouts too. And that's a whole nother topic that we could talk about for hours, or the Alamo scouts that had actually done pre-invasion reconnaissance on these beaches and said, hey, you know what? The jungle is really friggin' thick here. And by the way, the jungle actually meets the water's edge in certain points. So be advised, it's not going to be a cakewalk through the sand into the inland plains. Now, concerned with beach issues and the tides, the Marines employed the efforts of a couple of old friends, and we always like to mention our allies when we can, and this is no different here. Australian Major John Mather, who had been a labor contractor in Cape Gloucester before the war and had been attached to the 1st Marine Division during Guadalcanal, served as an integral part of Divisional D2, D as in dog, 2, planning, or during the planning. Other Australians, Andrew Kirkwall Smith and Anglican Reverend William Wiedemann, also helped orient divisional staff with the activity of the coastal areas as well as the native situation ashore. All of these men had deep knowledge of Cape Gloucester, having worked there, been a coast watcher there or a reverend there, respectively, depending on the person. And these guys informed the 1st Marine Division, basically saying, hey, look, this isn't like Guadalcanal. The jungle is actually even thicker on New Britain in this particular location than it ever was on Guadalcanal. So be prepared. The Marines, fresh from R&R in Melbourne, were as fresh as daisies. They were as fresh as they possibly could be. They're in peak physical condition, equipped with the newest and best infantry weapons and artillery available, and veterans of an incredibly tough campaign. So the 1st Marine Division, this is not their first rodeo by any means. They are ready to rock and roll. They were among the finest, if not the finest, troops the United States could field in any theater at this point in the war. Their enemy at Cape Gloucester, however, were not in the same physical or morale state, were they, Bill? The Japanese had a tough go of it, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. The Japanese, of course, had been here for a while. They were kind of, as we said earlier, General Kenny's air forces were able to pretty much obliterate any of the resupply barges and ships that were trying to help these folks. And so there was the 17th Division under Lieutenant General Sakai Yasushi was the leader of that division. But many of his men were veterans of China and hardened soldiers, while a formidable fighting force on paper, the Japanese of the 17th were not a complete unit at this time. They were supplemented by men known as the Matsuda Force, which consisted of one brigade and 2 infantry regiments. So again, they're formidable on paper, but by this time in the war, these men had been ravaged by jungle sickness and disease, as well as lack of food and supplies. Such was the complete mastery of the air that Kenny's forces possessed. The Japanese supply barges used to keep these people in supply were routinely sunk and destroyed, just thus leaving these specific Japanese nearly starving and sick almost to a man. Food was a major issue, as was the weather, as the monsoon season was in full force, as the Marines would soon find out. And anything above ground became soaked, and anything underground, such as fighting positions, became underwater. They were better suited for submarines than Marines. The Japanese defenders lived in, I'm not a comedian either, Seth, as you can see. The Japanese defenders lived in growing stages of squalor and disease. And while formidable on paper, and certainly while fresh, they were anything but fresh at this point when the old breed landed on December 26th, 1943, Seth.
That is very true. And that, again, we sound like a broken record talking about Japanese on these South Pacific Islands being starving and sick. It's because they were starving and they were sick. Even the freshest, most hardened combat troops, if you're exposed to malaria and dysentery and beriberi and God knows what the hell else, and almost constant aerial assault, it's going to wear on you. I don't care who you are. And these guys are no different. So to your point, Bill, if they were fresh, I think not that this is a cakewalk by any means, but if they were fresh, it would have been a lot worse than it already was. And it wasn't very good to begin with.
Right.
Shortly after dawn on December 26, 1943, the naval bombardment of the landing beaches signaled the start of this particular operation. The naval bombardment, which lasted about an hour, again, lessons of Tarawa hadn't hit home yet as in this part of the war. They was followed by aerial attacks by Kenny's aircraft as well as P-40s from the Royal Australian Air Force. Kenny's B-25s and A-20s dropped ordnance on suspected targets and were engaged by a single Japanese anti-aircraft gun. So it's a good sign that there isn't much opposition to the aircraft as they're flying over the beach, Bill, but the landing actually does go off very, very well, doesn't it?
It does. It's not quite the administrative landing that they enjoyed at Guadalcanal when they first landed. But again, the real enemy here was going to be the jungle. So
Right.
this is Yellow Beach 1, Yellow Beach 2. So these landings are occurring on the 26th, as is Green Beach. And of course, that means that these Marines were at sea on Christmas Day, trying to enjoy a little bit of Christmas before these landings occurred. Now, the target, there was a hill here. There was a kind of lack of imagination called Target Hill that was the original target of the assault for Yellow Beach landing troops. And kind of simultaneously, the troops would start marching to the northwest up the coast, because here's the airfield that's the real target of this assault. So the Marines land at this beach without opposition. They're clear of any Japanese, mainly because the jungle vegetation extended all the way to the water's edge. The Marines hacked through the jungle and began moving inland, where they ran into empty Japanese defensive positions. Once crossing the jungle and moving into a flat, dry space, the Marines advanced into what intelligence called a damp flat. What a euphemism that was. The Marines who walked into the damp flat sunk up to their necks. They're a little damp in an almost impenetrable swamp. Yeah, it's a little damp. And so Marines attempting to make their way through the area would fall into sinkholes waist deep or even neck deep, and had to be extricated by their comrades, often via rope. Any momentum the Marines had initially died in that swamp as men rapidly became exhausted. And, all of us have traipsed through ankle-deep mud and pulled our boots off and things like that. And you know how quickly you get really fatigued, even if you're in the best of shape. And when you're going into waist deep or neck deep, it's good. By the time you get pulled out of there, you've got to lay down for 20, 30 minutes just to get recovered. So that's the kind of speed or lack of speed that the Marines are enjoying at this point in this battle. The swamp itself became as deadly as the trees, rotted to the core or weakened by shell fire, began to fall around the Marines, killing at least this. And then the swamp was killing at least one man on D-Day. And by the end of the campaign, the swamp had killed somewhere around 50, Seth.
Yeah. The trees were literally just snapping and falling on top of guys as they were moving inland through this swamp. Again, it was not that the intelligence was poor. It was I think the interpretation of some of the aerial reconnaissance was very poor here. Again, as you said, the damp flat. There was one Marine quoted after the battle. He said to exactly what you said, Bill. Yeah, it was damp all the way to our friggin' necks. So, and that's what aerial reconnaissance is going to give you. Is it going to be, just a straight view down of the situation of the area? It's not going to tell you how deep that water is or anything else. And right. It was apparently pretty nasty. Despite the, quote, damp flat, slowing Marine advances to a crawl, elements of the 7th Marines managed to make their way out of the swamp and advance to and capture what was called Target Hill against scant opposition. All along the beachhead, the Marines were able to either move in or move out of the damp flat and held a position 1,000 yards deep by D-Day evening. So the swamp that was a pain in the neck, no pun intended, was actually something that they were able to push through with great effort. So theoretically, you could sit there and say, well, MacArthur's original plans were met, and technically they were. But you don't ever want to put that much, they got it, as they say, made up by just this much, on the end of the day there.
Yeah, but it was a division, not a regiment. They took
Right.
to
correct
to meet that penetration objective on day one, on D-Day. Yeah, good.
No doubt.
And that brings us to Green Beach. And so here we are again, looking at Green Beach on the west side, where it looks like, let's see, 2nd Regiment was landing. Is that right, Seth?
Second Battalion 1st. Yeah, 2-1.
2nd Battalion 1st Regiment. Yeah, that's right. 1st Marines. And so, yeah, that brings us there. And aside from the main landing, that was the diversionary landing at Taoli near Dampier Strait. Here, 2-1 landed and moved inland with 20 days of rations to keep them fed. Like their brothers at Yellow Beach, 2-1 received no opposition in their main landing, and all first-day objectives were secured by 1000. By nightfall, the Marines had established a strong perimeter as the monsoon rains began to fall. The Japanese had yet to respond. However, that was about to change, Seth.
So the 2-1 put out a lot of patrols that night because they knew, as you said, they hadn't seen, or very few Japanese, they hadn't seen any kind of determined resistance. They knew it was coming. I mean, this New Britain, it's a big island. It's full of Japanese. They know they're going to be coming sooner or later. Over the next several days, 2-1 holds their positions because that's what their orders were. And they send out patrols, and these patrols do begin to start clashing with Japanese patrols that are coming in towards their sector. All these continued clashes with these Japanese patrols indicate that a Japanese counterattack, however strong, is going to hit 2-1 in the very, very near future. And sure enough, on the night of December 30th, 1943, elements of the Japanese 53rd Infantry made a full-fledged night assault on Marine positions occupied by veterans of the Tinaroo River, those being G21, G Company 2nd Battalion 1st Marines. They were supplemented by E Company 2nd Battalion 1st and F Company 2nd Battalion 1st. Scattered throughout the riflemen were the machine gunners of H Company 2nd Battalion 1st. And you will remember that G and H and some elements of E were all on Elu Creek, Alligator Creek, Tinaroo River, whatever the hell you want to call it. Yeah, and they were all out there. So these guys are hardened veterans. They're used to, not that you can get used to it, but they know what to expect in a Japanese night counterattack. On the night of 29 through 30 December, it was like the majority of all nights on Cape Gloucester. It was raining. No surprise here. And I mean raining. This night was particularly nasty, however, as the winds had picked up significantly and the rain was coming down in sheets with lightning striking. They were in the middle of a really, really nasty thunderstorm is what it was. Lightning striking dangerously close to Marine positions. The lightning added to the very eerie situation as the Marines were keenly aware that the Japanese were coming that night. They could hear them down at the bottom of this hill, Bill. It's you can imagine how, even for a veteran, it's probably rather frightening sitting there in a lightning storm and, pouring rain, manning your weapon, and you can hear the Japanese at the bottom of the hill. They're coming up at you.
Yeah, I think these Marines were hoping for a repeat of Tinaroo River. The difference is there wasn't the clearing, right? They weren't charging down a barren beach with, no cover, no concealment, where they could be mowed down with vengeance. So at 01:55 on the 30th, the Japanese did charge. Apparently during the day, they'd reconned the area and discovered that the only approach up the hill where the Marines was the hill where the Marines were entrenched. The Japanese massed and poured their men in a large frontal assault directly in between a gap in G Company lines. The Marine perimeter was located at the top of a steep ridge of which the approaches, save one, were nearly impassable. So imagine this kind of ravine between a couple of ridges. And that's where the Japanese decide to begin their assault. However, they were able to locate the natural causeway between those ridges and exploit it perfectly. Supported by machine gun and mortar fire, they advanced up the causeway, and they were met with fierce Marine defensive fire. Yet, because they deployed their men in one sector, the Japanese were able to punch through and overrun, just by mass, several Marine positions and machine gun emplacements. So that means that the Marines were split into two bits, right? G Company tried to regroup and push through a violent counterattack that pushed the Japanese back down the ridge. G Company was aided by men from H Company as they filled in kind of casually depleted positions as they advanced, Seth.
Yep. There was one guy in H. I knew a ton of guys in H21. There was one guy in H Company specifically named Gunnery Sergeant Giuseppe Giuliano. I think he might be Italian, Bill. He may have some Italian.
Might be, yeah. The great Italian name. And I'll tell you what,
yeah, it is.
Look for information on the internet about Giuseppe Giuliano, and the only thing you find is I think there was an artist with the same name. You can find virtually nothing except PDFs of records of this battle. And that's it.
Yeah, he was a bad dude, though. He'd been around, he'd been in the Corps for quite some time. And the story goes, and it's confirmed by several men, is Giuliano grabbed a 1919. He grabbed a Browning 1919 A84 automatic weapon, and he had like a glove or a rag or something in one hand, and he was walking up the line in this counterattack, firing this 1919 from the hip. While simultaneously providing cover for the infantrymen as they kind of leapfrog back into their original positions. So I mean, he's a bad dude. He's a bad dude. The fighting continued throughout the night as the rain just continues to just pour down. The Japanese attempted a few more charges, but they were repulsed every time. So that one initial thrust was pretty much they'd shot their bolt there. Enemy fire finally stopped around 0700, allowing the Marines to advance down the causeway into the jungle to eliminate any threats remaining among the piles of dead sprawled out amongst the Marine positions and at the bottom of the ridgeline. This is pretty much the only fight that 2-1 sees on Gloucester. It's known as Coffin Corner. You hear there's a lot of Coffin Corners in the Pacific War and Europe for that matter too. But this is the Coffin Corner at Cape Gloucester. The majority of combat for 2-1 ends here. The Green Beach sector would remain quiet for the remainder of the campaign. So 2-1 is going to hang out in this sector pretty much for the remainder of the campaign. And aside from patrolling actions here and there, it's pretty much over here. But it is certainly not over for the rest of the campaign, is it?
No, it's not. No, they still need to take that airfield. And again, going back to the map, we're talking about Coffin Corner down here. And Yellow Beach landings have occurred. Target Hill is over here. And now they've got to start marching up that coastline to get to the airfield. So that's kind of where we are. So in D+2, which is December 28th, the Marines had moved near the airfields. They were supposed to capture and prepared to move across with tank support, which is good news. Elements of the 1st Marines moved towards the airfield with the tanks until they ran into a large concentration of Japanese entrenched with 75 millimeter field guns. Now, following the Shermans, the Marines steadily advanced against the Japanese positions, knocking them out with the help of the armored support. The tanks would roll up to the enemy positions and fire point blank into the apertures of those 75 millimeter guns, or simply crush the positions as they rolled over them. The initial defense with the 75 millimeter guns was easily defeated because of the fact that the 75s were firing only high explosives, which did absolutely nothing to armor or the Shermans in any way. So by the day's end, the Marines had moved over the airfields and destroyed any opposition in their way. By nightfall, they had established a perimeter of defense that would be needed because later that night, the Japanese, some 500 strong, hit 2-7 head on. In the fight that lasted until dawn, the Marines and Japanese slashed at each other in the swamp on the other side of the airfield. The fighting was close, vicious, and horribly confused. Men of both sides moved into the swamp only to become stuck. Many stopped and fought and died in the middle of the swamp. By morning, some 466 Japanese lay dead in and around the swamp, 2-7 having held the line, Seth.
Yeah, these Japanese assaults almost every single time result in mass death for the Japanese here in not just on Cape Gloucester, but literally everywhere almost. Whenever they do a large assault, they run into, fortified Marine or Army positions. It's just a bloodbath for the Japanese. But this was particularly bad because of the swamp. And it's not just the Japanese that are in the swamp, like you said, Bill, it's the Marine Corps too. The Marines are getting in there. And I mean, like you said in the beginning, when these guys are trying to advance through the swamp, more often than not, they get there and they can't get out. And that's what happened here in this particular area. A lot of that combat is in this swamp. And these guys get in there to take out enemy positions or patrols or whatever the hell the case may be. And they can't get out of there. And a lot of them get in there and they fight in there and they die in there on both sides, Marine Corps and Japanese. And it's just a nasty, 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 nasty fight. By December 30th, however, so we're kind of going back and forth here, a couple days here on either side. Old Glory is waving above the airfields on Cape Gloucester with their primary objectives acquired in a short few days and fighting at a reasonable clip. The Marines now sought to widen their beachhead and expand their perimeter by advancing towards the area of Borgen Bay, Aogiri Ridge, and towards Hill 660. So, Bill, if you bring up the map, you can see it pretty clear on there where these locations are. Yeah, there we go. So
yeah. So here's Hill 660 down here, and we're talking about Aogiri Ridge, which is right here. And pretty soon we're going to be talking about this very nasty geographic feature called Suicide by the Marines, called Suicide Creek. Seth?
Yep. The names that are given to places in battle are never good. It's never like, Unicorn Dream Field. It's always something really, really bad. And Suicide Creek, right. Coffin Corner is, it's kind of indicative of what happens there. On January 1st, Happy New Year, 1944, the Marines are ordered to renew their assault and push towards an area that would soon gain a nasty nickname, to your point, Bill, Suicide Creek. The terrain that the Marines advanced through or tried to advance through was as thick a jungle as they had seen yet, and that's saying something. Japanese positions, of which there were many, were completely concealed in the jungle and could not be seen until they either ambushed the Marines or the Marines literally ran into them. Marines of 2-7 were halted and could not advance. Marines of 3-7 and 3-5 advanced around the Japanese positions, but were also stopped in turn, thus not allowing the advance to continue. So, true to form, when the Japanese are in prepared defensive positions, they are not coming out of there unless they are pried out of there with explosives and, flamethrowers and or tanks. And this is exactly what happens here, Bill.
Yeah, they're dug in, occupied, prepared positions. It's going to take significant time. And at the end of the day, it saw the Marine lines in the shape of the letter U. The Japanese positions are simply too strong to break through at this point. Having an almost 100% artillery superiority, as well as possessing these new bazookas they were issued in Australia, the Marine attacks on these positions were not initially successful. Now, there's a great article by a man by the name of Edwin Bears, Bearss, in Proceedings magazine. It's the April 2010 issue of Proceedings. That's Naval Institute Proceedings magazine. And the article's titled Pinned Down at Suicide Creek. And Edwin Bears, I think he gets shot 4 times, Seth, once in the left elbow, once in the right shoulder, once in the buttocks, and I think once in the foot, and he survives the battle. And his firsthand story of his experience there at Suicide Creek with the extremely steep banks that lead down to the creek, and the fact that, even they're 10 yards away from the Japanese, pinned down, they can't get in or out, and there are as many shot and killed or wounded, they can't get themselves out. So the Japanese defensive positions in there were log and mud, which doesn't sound like much, but these aren't the coconut log and sand bunkers of Tarawa. So in theory, they should have been easier to destroy, Seth. However, the mud of Cape Gloucester, which there seemed to be an endless supply, literally absorbed the Marine artillery shells and bazooka rounds. The ground was so soft that these rounds would go into the ground, penetrate, and it's too soft for the shells to detonate, Seth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely infuriating when you're advancing against fixed Japanese positions and you are equipped with the new hot stuff. You know, you got the bazooka, which is designed to take out enemy armored vehicles and positions just like this, but the damn rain won't stop, so the whole friggin' place is a morass. It's a swamp. I mean, you know, hence the name. And the bazooka rounds that are designed to do this very kind of thing go into the mud and just go and stick there, and they don't go kaboom, nothing. And at this point it becomes very Tarawa-esque that they have to get in there and go position by position by position and pry these people out of each and every position. And then on top of that, you mentioned earlier, Bill, that a lot of these that anything underground was inundated by the rains, and they were. And several of these positions were not only connected with interconnecting trenches, believe it or not, they had subterranean tunnels, which at this point are filled with water. Some of the Japanese actually had, well, they didn't have to, they waded through the tunnels to get to the positions. So when some of these positions would get knocked out, they would, much like any other position anywhere else occupied by Japanese, they'd come back to life. So once these guys are taking these positions, they're having to sit in there and occupy these positions until they can be leapfrogged. So this advance is a snail's pace.
Yeah, and Tarawa, remember the Marines said, what do they have, a tunnel back to Tokyo? It must have felt because they would knock a position out and then suddenly there'd be Japanese in that position again that got there through the tunnels. And it must have felt kind of that way here as well. Different Marine division, same experience. But in order to do that with armor, the Marines had to construct basically a corduroy road across the coastal swamp area and eventually bring the Shermans to the fight with the entrenched Japanese from behind. Before this, the infantry had been supported by tanks but here the tanks couldn't get through the swamp. Right. So the Marines labored mightily to build this corduroy road and bring the tanks up. But even after they did this, they had to get the tanks across the now named Suicide Creek. Well, the creek was not deep or wide, some 15 feet wide, it'd be somewhere between 10 and 15, depending on the location. It had very steep banks, like I said earlier, that the tanks could not negotiate. Now, to solve this new problem, the Marines brought a bulldozer forward to clear the banks and transform them into a smoother grade, to kind of level grade the banks of this creek. As the dozer came forward and began to work on the creek bank, the Marine driving the dozer was shot and killed. Another driver, amazingly, volunteered to take his place, got up, starts clearing, leveling the bank again, and he's shot and killed. The Marines holding the position on the opposite side of the creek could not see the assailant to take him out. To pin the phantom sniper down, what they did is they just poured fire across the creek. A third amazingly volunteered and finally cleared the creek bank by operating the dozer, by kind of squatting down or hiding down behind the dozer's, shovel, and operating the dozer with a shovel and axe handles to operate the controls of the bulldozer, as opposed to sitting exposed in the driver's seat. And that's the only way he wasn't killed. And of course, American ingenuity at its finest, Seth.
Yeah. It's pretty ingenious, really. To your point, he literally drove and operated the levers and the pedals and everything with the dozer, standing beside it, out of the way of fire, using axe handles and shovel handles to press and pull and do whatever he had to do. Obviously, that takes some time with a man who's operating a dozer with a shovel and an axe, but eventually it does get done. The following morning, it literally takes these guys all day and all night, or one guy, all day and all night to grade this out to where the tanks can get across. The following morning, now with tank support, the Marines renewed their assault and cleared the Japanese out of the area, advancing towards Aogiri Ridge. Aogiri Ridge, it'll get a new name here in a minute, which will be probably more familiar to people than Aogiri Ridge. But this is just a slow, methodical, sloppy, nasty advance all the way from really from D-Day. As you said, mud in abundance, a never-ending supply of mud. That, I think that's pretty much the recurring theme of Cape Gloucester, is never-ending supply of mud and rain. Now, advances by 3-7 under Colonel Chesty Puller were limited in the area of Aogiri Ridge. The Japanese, tied in like a horseshoe, would not give ground. No surprise there. Over a period of 3 days, the line did not change, and Marine assaults with tanks and half-tracks failed. 3-7 having worn themselves completely out over the last several days, was relieved by 3-5 under the command of Colonel Lew Walt. The fresh troops renewed the advance, although ever so slowly, literally crawling up the ground as it rose towards the ridge line. Following an artillery barrage against the top of the ridge, Walt's men renewed their attack. Progress was excruciatingly slow as the men wore themselves out on the terrain, heat, humidity, and exceedingly heavy Japanese defensive fire. The terrain was so thick that the Marines could not see more than 10 yards ahead on any one side. Enemy machine guns were completely concealed and could and did open up without being seen even after they fired. Many of the Japanese were killed when the Marines actually fell into their positions or stumbled into them while crawling forward. Bill, that is some seriously close combat.
Yeah, it is. And knowing he needed some sort of close-in artillery support, Walt called for the only weapon that his men could move themselves, a 37 millimeter. The Japanese were using 75 millimeters. These Marines brought in a 37 millimeter. And talk about the 37 a bit for us, Seth.
So the 37 millimeter is a pretty utilitarian piece of equipment. It's a very small artillery piece that is able to be moved by hand. If you recall the Tinaroo River battle, we talked about 37 millimeters up at the Sandspit at the mouth of the creek right there, that they were firing canister shot into the Japanese Iki's men as they were charging across the Sandspit. It's a deadly, deadly, deadly weapon. It wasn't much use in Europe because of the German armor was so beefy. 37 is like throwing a tennis ball at a wall. It's not going to do anything to German armor, but it did do things to Japanese armor. And when you can't get any real artillery support because of the friggin' mud that we were talking about up there, and even the artillery support that is landing amongst you is landing literally amongst you because the Japanese are on top of you. You're only 10, 15 yards away from these people. You can't really call too much 105 fire in there without putting your own men at risk. So the only thing that they can really bring, up there to help with this assault is this 37 millimeter. And I'll show a picture of it here. I think we got some footage, but I know I got pictures of it. It's a small piece of artillery that can easily be moved by 2 men. I say easily moved on flat ground, not up a ridge in the mud in a torrential monsoon, Bill.
Yeah, that's right. So 3-5 Marines manhandled this weapon up the slopes of the ridge until they ran into enemy fire. Not being able to see, they would fire canister rounds into the knotted jungle to clear out the Japanese. And again, that's another big difference between this battle and the Tinaroo, where they're firing into, jungle here, not some barren beach. Most of the time, this trick worked, but the weapon had to be pushed up the steep ridge under fire to clear a path. Colonel Walt himself often threw his shoulder on the 37 and pushed the weapon up the ridge alongside his Marines. And by the end of the day, the Marines had made progress, albeit slowly, and then they dug in for the night. In places, the Marines and Japanese were only 10 yards apart. Another reason you can't call in artillery fire. This is danger close. Wow, you're calling artillery fire on yourself at this point if you're going to do it. So the 37 really is the only option. Walt's men had knocked out 37 log and earth, 37, not 37 millimeter, but 37 log and earth bunkers. Almost all were filled with enemy automatic weapons and had to occupy the enemy positions so as to ensure that the tunnel from Tokyo wouldn't cause them to be reoccupied by the Japanese.
Mm-hmm. As the night wears on, Walt's men could hear the Japanese apparently being reinforced and prepping for a counterattack. Now, they're not up at the very tip top of the ridge here, but they're damn close. Knowing that an attack was almost sure to come, Walt called for every man who could walk to man the front line. So he's bringing people up from the bottom of the ridge, bringing them up to the top because he knows this assault is coming. He can literally hear the Japanese psyching themselves up. He can hear bayonets being clicked onto rifle. He's not stupid. He knows something's about to, as they say, the defecation's about to hit the ventilation. The useful 37 millimeter was placed dead center in the Marine Corps lines. At 0115 on January 10th, the Japanese launched the first of 5 assaults up the reverse slope of the ridge held by Walt's men. The initial assault was repelled, and the Japanese pulled back and massed for a second charge. Now, I had a good friend. If anybody's ever seen the miniseries The Pacific, you know who R.V. Bergen was. He was a very, very good friend of mine. I knew Bergie for years and years and years. This is one of Bergie's first this really is his first instance of combat. He was not a Guadalcanal veteran. He's a guy that came in after the canal. He's one of the new guys that'll finish the war with the 1st Marine Division. Bergie recalled that there was a Japanese somewhere down on the reverse slope of this ridge, yelled at the positions of K Company 3rd Battalion 5th, identifying the machine gun sergeant of K35 by name. His name was Raider. He would yell, the Japanese yelled, quote, "Raider, why you no fire," unquote. Raider, who was within about 4 yards of Bergie, apparently Raider replied to his gunner, quote, "Let the bastard have a burst," unquote. The gunner did so, and the Japanese yelled no further. About an hour and a half later, the Japanese charged again, this time right at K Company 3rd Battalion 5th. Bergie recalled, I remember this story he told me vividly. He recalled that as he was sitting in his crouching in his foxhole, he looked up at one point in a flash of probably a flare and could see a Japanese soldier silhouetted at the edge of his foxhole. Now Bergie's he's close to the top of the ridge, but not at the top. He takes his M1, he had an M1 Garand at this time, is with a bayonet. He sticks it up into the Japanese, picks this Japanese up on the end of the bayonet and just dumps all 8 rounds from the M1 into the body of this Japanese, and then flips this guy over the back end of his shoulder and rolls him on down the ridge. That's how close the fighting was up the top of Aogiri, what is now going to be called Walt's Ridge, Bill. This is a nasty, nasty scrap.
It is. It's so bad that Walt even brings guys up from headquarters company and he brings the cooks. So he has everybody who could hold a rifle engaged at this point because he knows this is a do or die fight this night. So 5 Japanese assaults come at Walt's men, with one assault piercing the Marine lines and getting within 5 yards of Walt's foxhole himself. With ammunition dangerously low, Walt finally decides to call in a 105 fire and drops the rounds within 50 yards. He figures everybody outside of 50 yards, hopefully the 105s will take care of everybody inside of 50 yards. He hopes he has enough ammunition to take care of. And in some places, he has less. The 105 rounds dropping in even closer than 50 yards to his Marine lines. By the time the 5th assault came, many Marines were out of ammunition. The Marine artillery is crediting with stopping the 5th and final Japanese charge. So the guys are just basically down to bayonet defenses at this point. So the fight at Aogiri Ridge, now called Walt's Ridge, is essentially the final nail in the Japanese coffin at Cape Gloucester. The Japanese, now bereft of men to commit a meaningful assault, were now bound to the defense for the remainder, or now bound to defend themselves for the remainder of this action, Seth.
Yeah, this is Walt's Ridge if of all the fights that were on Cape Gloucester, Walt's Ridge and the next one we're going to talk about were by far the worst. Walt's Ridge was a bloodbath that night. Very, very, typical of most nighttime Japanese infantry assaults on Marine positions. Again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I mean, this was close, just visceral, man-to-man, hand-to-hand combat that entire night long. The final piece of the puzzle at Cape Gloucester lay directly in front of the Marines, a hill some 660 meters high that was the last known occupied Japanese position in this area. Rupertus wanted that position taken as he feared that a hill of that height could, and did, harbor Japanese artillery spotters that could and would direct fire onto the airfield and beaches. Kicking the assault off on January 12th, 3-7 led the move. The grade uphill, what is now known as Hill 660, was so steep and so dense was the jungle that the Marines often had to sling their weapons and crawl hand over hand up the craggy jungle-infested hillsides. Again, the terrain on Gloucester, the fighting was vicious when it was there. There wasn't a whole lot of fighting, but when there was fighting, it was nasty. The friggin' terrain and the weather is what sticks in the minds of and we'll get to that in a minute, of every guy that was ever there. Back at 660, Japanese strength estimates were a reinforced company, and that's close to accurate, as there were more than that on top of the hill, which was also infested with, no surprise here, automatic weapons out the wazoo. Japanese defenses were strong enough to stop cold the Marine assault, even with tank support, and force the Marines of 3-7 to pull back to their original positions, having accomplished nothing during the day except take casualties, Bill.
Yeah, now I'm going to go back to the map again just for a short bit, Seth, because here we go. Here's Waltz Ridge here, and we're talking about Hill 660 here, and you can see how steep it is. Now you say, well, that's a long way. No, look at the range, reference down here. This is 1 mile down here. So we're talking about a mile from Hill 660, maybe a mile and a quarter, mile and a half to Waltz Ridge. So this is very short distances and a lot of intense, concentration of force along these very short distances. So a flanking movement along the coast, and again, I'll pull it up to show you. This is the flanking movement along the coast to Hill 660, with the aid of bulldozer and Shermans, isolated 660 from any reinforcement. But the Japanese at the top of the hill still had to be eliminated. So on January 14th, this has gone on now. Remember, December 26th, January 14th, it's been a couple of weeks, 3 weeks. Yeah, the attack continued with 3-7 picking up its way up the hill, trying to find a soft spot in the Japanese lines. With tank support, the Marines had been able to work their way around to the southern face of the hill, back on this side here. And so, that's a little bit of progress, where 2 ravines made the tanks hold their ground. And moving up with the armor, the Marines finally located the soft spot they had been searching for. And despite being absolutely exhausted, as you can imagine, sick, soaked, wet, waterlogged, and short on food, they surged upwards, reaching the crest of 660. As soon as they reached the crest, they came under heavy machine gun fire, which was silenced by 3-7 mortars. They were directed by the men at the crest. And this reminds me again of that famous video you showed on Batio, Seth, of the one bit of Medal of Honor video that exists during the entirety of the war. And, that kind of, topping the hill under extreme fire with the Japanese shooting down. The mortar fire finally did draw the Japanese out of their positions and forced them to run down the slope, just like in Batio, smack into the lines of the weapons company, which tore the Japanese into shreds. Seth.
Yep. Yeah, the Marines secure Hill 660 just as the heavens opened. Again, no surprise here. Torrential rain inundated those in old Japanese foxholes and positions for 2 solid days. Rain did not let up for 48 hours. On January 16th, 2 companies of Japanese charged up the slopes of Hill 660 in an all-out banzai charge, only to be slaughtered to a man by the Marines holding the hill. With the capture of Hill 660 and the subsequent defense of it, the Marine role, for all intents and purposes, on Cape Gloucester was over. Bill, there's some brief film footage that I'm going to show now of these Marines, some of these Marines from 3-7. They're sitting in the back of a deuce and a half, and they're being pulled off of Hill 660. Fresh people are going up there and occupying their lines. And when you look at the faces of these guys, it's actually pretty famous footage, but most people don't know it is from Hill 660 on Cape Gloucester. These guys are smoked. I mean, they are done. They are absolutely exhausted. Every single one of them has got the 1,000-yard stare. I mean, they're done.
Exactly what I was thinking of. I mean, that whole term was coined during the Pacific Campaign, as I recall. And so, this is, You can imagine why they feel that way. They're completely spent, barely alive, psychologically and physically 100% exhausted. And that 1,000-yard stare where you don't even have enough energy to get your facial muscles to move. That's what generates that. It was commonplace, not just in Pacific, but of course, that's where the term was first coined, Seth.
Yep. And then as I said, that once the Marines get off of 660, once 3-7 gets off of 660, that's pretty much the end of the combat for the Marine Corps on Cape Gloucester. Now, the Army does come relieve them later on, and there is more combat. It's nothing really of any significant severe action. This is pretty much it. But
whatever happened to the parachute infantry regiment? I mean, why weren't they used as reserve forces or reinforcements?
So the paratroopers, and we've had questions on this before, and we will talk about airborne operations in the Pacific. Believe it or not just Corregidor, there were airborne operations in the Pacific theater. When people think of airborne in World War II, they think 101st and 82nd, and rightfully so. But there were quite a few airborne operations in the Pacific. They were not deployed here. They were deployed at another little place called NADZAB, which is an event that we haven't talked about, and maybe we should here in the near future. But it occurs at roughly about the same time, a couple months difference. But still, yeah, they were not deployed here. Army, I forget what unit off the top of my head comes and relieves 1st Marine Division here. But it's suffice it to say, Cape Gloucester was not, as John Parshall liked to say, it was not top billing when it came to posts where you wanted to be. And even after the majority of the fighting was over, this was not a place you wanted to be. The final tally of all events like this, of all operations, sadly, is tabulated through casualties. Bill, what were the casualties like on both sides for this operation?
The Marines suffered 310 KIA and further 1,083 wounded. Japanese suffered over 2,000 killed. Now, so it's not quite 2,000 killed, 310 killed. We hate to think in terms of exchange ratios.
Right.
If you do think in terms of exchange ratios, this is the kind of weight you want it to have, but it's still a lot of KIA for the Americans. And while the casualties were certainly not Tarawa-esque, the fighting was tough, the terrain almost impassable, and the weather miserable. I remember the Marines that were soaking wet on Tarawa, on Basio, were soaking wet because they had to wade ashore, not because they were rained on continuously for 3 frickin' weeks. Most veterans at Cape Gloucester didn't mention much of the fighting, as unless you were in 3-7 or 3-5, there wasn't much of it to see. The weather was what made Gloucester a hellhole, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. And while, you always have to assess, guys like us, that's what we do, right? We assess an operation after the fact. Was this a good operation? Was this a bad operation? Was it a failure? Was it a success? Whatever. Ultimately, it's a success, obviously, because we land on Gloucester. The Marines go in there and they capture their objectives. They kill or push away all the Japanese in the area. The 2 airfields are secured. However, you never want to say that an operation that costs American lives or any life for that matter is a waste or unnecessary. But Cape Gloucester sadly may fall into that category. And you got to reflect on what you talked about at the beginning of this episode, Bill, where General Kenny said, we really don't need this place. We've got Rabaul secured. We've got the area neutralized. We really don't need to expend men, material, blood, and treasure capturing something that we don't need. And of course, hindsight is always 20/20. And you look at this operation, and it kind of sadly was unnecessary, wasn't it?
Yeah. Some commenter is probably going to say, oh, you're doing Monday morning quarterbacking. But you know what? That's Monday morning quarterbacking is also called after action reports or lessons learned. And the thing that people fail to understand is that you take these airfields, if you're going to use them, that requires resources. You have to put security forces in place. You have to resupply them. All these things consume resources and dilute your effort, right? Your offensive effort going forward. So the question then becomes, is it better to have them or not worth the expense of having them? that kind of Monday morning quarterbacking needs to happen, because we've got a lot more war to fight. We are going to be struggling for resources, not as much as the Japanese, but we're on the offensive, and it consumes more resources to be on the offensive than on the defensive. So it's really important to analyze these kinds of battles and ask yourself, should this have happened? Where can we make this same mistake in the future? And what can we learn from it to avoid making that kind of mistake in the future? And the answer is, there were plans to move the 13th Air Force there in 1944, but just as General Kennedy stated, the war had passed the area by, and the movement of the 13th to Gloucester would have been a waste of time and material. By August 44, the Cape Gloucester area was a backwater. So it absolutely turned out not to be worth it. Kenny was right from the beginning, Seth.
He was. The one thing that could be said of Cape Gloucester, it did, or the after effects, it did support the Admiralty operations in February 1944, serving as an emergency landing field for damaged aircraft. That's it. Mm-hmm. That's okay. Literally it. The airfield, but I'm just saying that's not really why we took the place. The airfields remained. No, the airfields remained in use until 1945. But again, by that time, the war had long since passed Cape Gloucester up. So the two airfields that MacArthur wanted captured for the continued neutralization of Rapal were not even used in any kind of major offensive manner ever. Never. So, the misery that was suffered by the 1st Marine Division on Cape Gloucester was, for all intents and purposes, sadly not necessary.
We talked about misery index when we were talking about Guadalcanal, where we said the misery index for the Marines during the 6-month campaign was significantly higher than the Navy. The Navy suffered 3 times the number of fatalities. But misery index is not nothing. It's something. And there are times when you're so miserable, you say, just kill me now, right? And just be done with it. And I expect that there were Marines I know that there were on Guadalcanal, but as well here, that felt that way. And despite the fighting being essentially over and done with in January, the 1st Marine Division stayed on Gloucester until April 44, before moving to an equally crappy place called Pavuvu, before the next operation, which would see the Old Breed hit the shores of yet another horrible place. And perhaps this was Chesty Puller's nadir, to use that expression, Peleliu, Seth.
Yeah. Not that any unit in the Pacific ever had an easy time of it. 2nd Marine Division got to, after Guadalcanal, they got to camp out in New Zealand, and then after Tarawa, they went to Hawaii. So there's worse places to go, but considered where they've been. The 1st Marine Division, after Melbourne, when they leave Melbourne, they get the shaft for the rest of the war, man. And they go to Pavuvu, they go to Cape Gloucester, and then after Cape Gloucester, they go to Pavuvu, which, if you don't know anything about Pavuvu, it was nasty. It was a former coconut plantation that had been unoccupied for years in the Russell Islands. The place was infested with rats, and I'm talking rats as big as dogs. These things were huge, huge rats, land crabs out the yin-yang, rotten coconuts as far as the eye could see, and absolute zero types of shelter or any type of comfort at all for the 1st Marine Division. So when they left Gloucester in April of 44 and they dropped these guys on the shores of Pavuvu, granted it was an unoccupied island, they turned around and looked, and they were like, you got to be kidding me here. You've absolutely got to be kidding me.
This is where we're going to recover? Yeah, not so much.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. And when we get to Peleliu, and obviously we can talk a little bit more about Pavuvu, because it sets the stage for the suffering level, for the misery level that you talked about there just a second ago. Pavuvu is certainly not a place of luxury for the Marines as they're about to hit the shores of Peleliu. And that's, of course, several months down the line. But the misery index suffered.
Do I remember seeing in Pacific where gunnery sergeant starts raining in Pavu, and the gunnery sergeant strips naked in the middle of the rain shower and takes a shower.
Oh yeah,
using the rain.
that's a true story.
Lathering up, and then it stops raining, and he says, "Oh, don't do this to me. I got to rinse off."
Yep, that is a true story. That's Gunnery Sergeant Pop Haney, as they called him. God's honest truth. Yeah, it was a miserable place. It was the misery factor suffered by the 1st Marine Division in World War II had to be the highest of any unit in the Pacific. I mean, they just got the shaft 24 hours after Melbourne. It was a screw fest from then on. So, Bill, do you have anything else you want to say about this operation before we wrap it up?
No, again, we say that every operation is important, and every operation is tragic for the soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen who fought it, and this one is no different, Seth.
No, not at all, not at all. And it's oft forgotten when it's kind of sandwiched in between Guadalcanal and Peleliu when it comes to the history of the 1st Marine Division, but it was certainly not a cakewalk. And just before we go, I just want to say this: guys who were on Guadalcanal, who had been there for the entire 6-month campaign and then went to Gloucester, often said, God bless them, that life on Cape Gloucester was actually worse than life on Guadalcanal. And now, as you know, Bill, that is saying something right there. That is a strong statement. Yeah. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. Also, if you want to see the video version of this or any of our other episodes, please subscribe to our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. If you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Paradin. I want to thank you very much for listening. Bill.
I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.